Well, my name is Kay Richards, and today our San Francisco Korean American Museum video project is interviewing Mrs. Doris Pummill, who is a third generation Korean American, and we don't often see multi-generation Korean Americans, and so I was so delighted that you were willing to participate in this program, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my honor, thank you.
Well, since you are a multi-generation person, maybe a good place to start would be your grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell us what brought them here and how their life was and so on.
Thank you, thank you. You know, this makes me think about the pilgrims who came here in the 16th century and how thereafter the Daughters of the American Revolution was formed. Kind of is similar when you gather history. You go for the first people who came. And my grandfather, his name is Reverend Soon Hyun. My grandmother, his wife Maria, came to the United States in 1903. And my grandfather was hired by the East-West Development Company, and they were in charge of looking for laborers for the sugar plantations in Hawaii. And my grandfather was chosen because he understood English. And so they boarded the second ship that docked in Hawaii. And my grandparents lived in Hawaii for a little over 3 years. And in that time, my grandmother had my Aunt Alice, the oldest, my mother, Elizabeth, and then their brother, Peter Hyun. And they lived there for 3 years, and my grandfather had no intentions of staying in America. He had his family in Korea. He was an only son, and he had his parents still in Korea. I'm not sure, but it might have been in Seoul. I never did go that far to find out where. But so they returned to Korea, and thereafter there were, let's see, that's 3, there were 5 children who were born later to my grandmother and grandfather. And they lived there until 1919, when, you know, there was the revolution, when there was the proclamation for independence from the Japanese government. I will tell you that my grandfather was the man that was sent out to the countryside to proclaim that independence. And when March 1st, 1919 occurred, he's the one that announced that we should all gather our sources and declare our independence. Well, after that was done, he was forced to leave Korea because, of course, the Japanese were looking for all the people who were making this noise. And so he, along with other patriots, left for Shanghai. And there they formed the provisional government. Provisional meaning it was not a recognized government, but it was a government that was proclaimed by the revolutionaries. And my grandmother, in the meantime, with the 8 children, eventually got to Shanghai. And there they settled. Well, since they had the government, they had to do something about it. And my grandfather was the foreign minister for that government and was soon sent as the ambassador plenipotentiary to claim that independence from Japan. And he carried the independence statement around the world. He boarded the ship in Shanghai, and he went all the way around and got to Marseille, France, and then went to England, and then came to Washington, D.C., where he met up with Sigmund Rhee, who was a part of that government. And anyway, as the story goes, he was there in Washington for 2 years, but he was a family man too, and he was a Christian, and he felt an obligation to his family. So he left Washington, and he took this train ride across the country. And along the way, he tried to meet as many Koreans who might have gone into different parts of the United States. And I guess he gathered money to take back to Shanghai. And then he went back to Hawaii. And of course he knew people there because he had been there in 1903 to 1906, and he met them. So he got back to Shanghai, was greeted by the government and the family, and he felt an obligation to take care of his family now. He had given to his country, and he felt he could still do it in another way. So he accepted a position with the Methodist Church, and he, with his family, went to the island of Kauai. There were many plantation workers there, and they needed a Korean minister. So they settled in Kauai, and he was there. He was there pretty much until the beginning of World War II, and he served that parish. And my uncles tell the story that every Sunday, it was a very special thing for the Korean laborers to come to Kapaye, where the church was, because there my grandmother and some of the women would cook Korean food, as well as my grandfather serving the church. So my uncles would drive the car to go and pick up these laborers, and a community grew. So that's one part. That's a long story. I don't know if you. And my mother was there, and you wonder, well, how did I grow up in New York City? How did I get there? But I was born in New York City, and how that happened was because my father was in New York City the time that my grandfather was in Kauai, and he was on his way back to Korea to find a Korean wife. He did not want to find, he wanted a Korean girl, he said. And he had a brother in Honolulu, and that's how he came from Korea to Honolulu to New York. And it was time for him to return, he felt. So on the way back, his brother said, you don't have to go to Korea to find a Korean wife. There's a nice Korean girl in Kauai. Maybe you can find her. So he, it wasn't that easy in those days to get from one island to the other. You had to take a ferry. So he boarded the ferry and went to Kauai, and he met my mother. And he asked, I don't know, I don't know how they do those things. He just saw her. Then he must have asked her father if he could marry his daughter. And my grandfather was a very liberal person, and he said, you can't ask me, you have to ask her. Isn't that something? I think that was something. Well, my mother I think she was in her early 20s by then. And she was older than her brothers and sisters, and she was sent to a junior high school to learn English, but she didn't like that. I mean, she didn't want to go to school with younger children. So she accepted the proposal, and they were married in Honolulu. And then thereafter they went back to New York, and that's where my brother, myself, and my sister were born. And that's how we started. Was there something else you wanted?
Maybe you can explains the picture to us.
Okay.
That's a very old picture. And
this is my mother. This is my older brother and myself. And this picture was taken in Kauai. And I'm about 2 years old, and my brother's about 3 years old. My mother took both my brother and I back to Kauai to her family. She needed to see her family, and she wanted us to meet the family. So, you know, and that was a very difficult trip. You had to take the train from New York City to Chicago. You had to take the train from Chicago to San Francisco. You had to board a ferry from Oakland to San Francisco to get on the ship. You had to take the ship to Honolulu, then you had to take the ferry to Kauai. So I don't know how long it took, but I think it took a long time, especially with 2 children who were still in diapers by herself. I think that's quite admirable. You know, she had limited English, but she did it on her own. Yeah.
Well, your grandparents were definitely very much into independence movement.
Oh, yes.
Which characterizes the Korean American life in the 1900s, even in San Francisco. And you mentioned that your grandfather knew Dosan An Chang-ho.
He worked with him.
He worked with him.
In Shanghai.
Oh.
There's a picture of him with the Dosan in the center, and he's sitting next to him. I think it's in the archives in Los Angeles, USC. You can look it up.
So did you, you were born in New York, and so what was your young age like, your childhood? And
Well, if I look back, it was difficult. I was born in the Bronx, New York, but eventually my father said it would be better to be among Asians, so we moved to Chinatown, New York, on Mott Street. And he bought a barbershop, and he had a business. And now in Chinatown, there's only Chinese people. And this, don't forget, is in the 30s, and China was being invaded by Japan. So the Chinese people called us Japanese. Yeah, very few people knew about Korea at that time. In fact, most people in America didn't know what a Korean was until the Korean War. People would ask, well, you're Chinese. No, I'm not Chinese. You're Japanese. No, I'm not Japanese. Then what are you? That is exactly how they looked at us, because there were so few. And when I was growing up, we were the only Korean family in Chinatown. The only time that we met with Koreans was in the Korean Methodist Church, which was way uptown by Columbia University. The Koreans had a brownstone, and the brownstone building was divided so that there was a church on the level floor. There was a Korean minister, and there were mostly men, students or businessmen who came to the church. And but it was a place where, again, meals were served. There were no Korean restaurants. There were no Korean grocery stores. So Korea was just not represented in any form. I tell you, one of my earliest memories was that my brother and I had to perform at the church. You know, the church is maybe only about, I don't know, 20 chairs. And they said, no, we want you to sing a Korean song, my brother and I. So you know what? They taught us, 예수 사랑 하시문, right? Jesus loves me. And I can remember learning that song and standing up and singing that song with my brother. So that's one of my earliest memories. There was another family there, but they lived in uptown New York, and their last name was Namgung. I don't know whether people remember, but Mr. Nangum became, I think, the first ambassador that President Syngman Rhee chose for New York, for the U.S. to be represented for his government. But that was the family, the second family, Korean family in New York. And then there was a third family, and that was the minister's family, and I think their name was Moon. And there was a fourth family that lived in New Jersey, but those were the only Koreans I ever saw when I was growing up. But I think that for that reason, my father and my mother felt that we should not grow up in Chinatown. We would never be accepted as Chinese, and it was too isolated. So we moved to Los Angeles. So that's how we got to California.
And so you went to UCLA.
Eventually. Yep. Well, actually, before I went to UCLA, my parents decided that my brother went to Yale, and since we're only a year apart, we went to school. We went to college the same year. He was accepted at Yale, and my parents thought that I should go and live with my grandparents in Honolulu. And I attended the University of Hawaii for my first year. So I had another introduction to my family, which was wonderful. It was really, I had never seen my grandparents that I could remember, because we had left, my brother and I had left Kauai a year after we got there, so we were only about 3 or 4 years old. Maybe 4 or 5 years old when we went back to New York. And it was nice to be with my halmani and harabaji. Very nice. I never had that before. And I had aunts and uncles there. Yeah.
You had, I mean, your grandparents had 8 children. Are they all in this area, or?
Well, let's see. One eventually died in China. She was handicapped. And she never got to the U.S. But the rest 7 came. And my mother was the first one to come to New York. My uncles, Peter and Paul, came to New York to study. And eventually my Aunt Alice came. So I did see them for a little while, but they returned to Hawaii and lived there.
You can tell us more about the book about your aunt that that you were just showing us about.
Well, before my aunt's book, you know, there's my uncle's book, Mansei. He wrote that in the 80s. And it's in English. And about 4 years ago, it was translated into Korean. So it's available in Korean also. So he writes about his experience growing up in Korea and declaring the independence, Mansei, and about his experience in the U.S. He attended Purdue University, but eventually he came to New York because he wanted to be an actor. And he had an interesting life because, you know, it was a time of the Depression. And one of the greatest things that President Franklin Roosevelt did was he remembered people and he remembered the arts. And he formed the Federal Theater, which my Uncle Peter joined. And there he joined other actors and actresses, and they formed theater groups in New York. And my other uncle, Paul, was an artist, and he went to the Art Students League in New York City and became a sculptor. So that's my second uncle. And my aunt was the oldest, and she felt an obligation to help her family. And she had a son who was with her mother in Hawaii. So they eventually all went back to Hawaii before World War II. I think it was before World War II. You know, that Pearl Harbor happened December 7th, 41. I think they went back before that. But they were there and were there until the end of the war in 1945. After my uncle, let's see, there's my Aunt Alice, my mother is the second, Peter is the third, Paul is the fourth. After Paul is Joshua, and then the sixth is David, and the last is Mary. And if you notice, they're all Christian names. They were all baptized by my grandfather, including his wife is named Maria. But my grandfather, being the Korean man, he kept his original name. He never gave himself a Christian name, which I think was very interesting. So anyway, I did. Eventually, I went back. I went to the University of Hawaii for a year. And then I went back to Los Angeles, and there I attended UCLA, and I graduated from UCLA in 1951. My brother graduated from Yale in 1950. And the third was my sister, and she was 5 years younger than myself. So she was going to school in New York at the time.
But you also said you went to Columbia and got a degree in social work.
Oh, yeah, I did. I got a degree in social work in 1958. And I went into social work just by happenstance. I had graduated from UCLA with a degree in history. You can't do much with a degree in history in 1951. What I did was to go and work with the county, Los Angeles County, and worked as a clerk. And I said, I can't do this the rest of my life. So there were only a couple of vocations open to women at that time. You were either a teacher or nurse. Well, I knew I didn't want to go into nursing. So I decided I'd go back to UCLA and get a teaching degree. But as it happened, I was very fortunate. While working as a clerk, I was busy reading the classified papers, and I saw that there was this ad, and it said, "Professional women with college degrees wanted." So I called up, I answered the ad, and I said, "Well, what is it?" She said, "Well, it's about Girl Scouting." And I said, "Oh, I was a Girl Scout. I loved being a Girl Scout. It was one of my avenues for learning when I was growing up." "Well, what does that mean?" "Well, you'll have to come for an interview. We have a job for you." So I left my place of work and hardly returned to that job because I was hired by Girl Scouting. And I had to, there were several steps to becoming a field director for the Girl Scout Council. And what that meant was that as a professional worker with Girl Scouting, I was an organizer for going to churches and schools and different communities to set up Girl Scout troops and to inform them, to teach them, and to organize them as to how to help young girls to become Girl Scouts. Well, as a result of that experience, the next step was to go into social work. And through the Girl Scouts, I obtained a scholarship to go to Columbia University, and I went to the School of Social Work. And there I learned more, and I decided that I'd have to pay back the Girl Scouts for 1 year, for the year that they gave me, and I did that. Then I went back to the School of Social Work and finished my second year, and I became a caseworker to work with different social agencies. That's how I became a social worker. And I was a social worker for 20 years.
You had a really long and very varied career too. You also worked in small business, and you worked in mission work too with your husband Joe. And maybe you can share some highlights of that long mission work.
Glad to.
Yeah.
Well, as a social worker, I have to tell you that after I finished my degree, I said, you know, at that time, I would have to enter mainstream organizations. I would not be able to work with Koreans. I would not be able to work with Chinese or any Asian group. There were no such things then. So I had this thought that maybe, you know, when we were growing up, my father always said, you must go back to Korea and work. You must do what you can for Korea. And so I said, well, maybe that's what I have to do, is go back to Korea. So while I was in New York, I attended the Asian Studies program, and I was counseled to first start to learn Chinese. Can you imagine? I mean, I'm in my 20s and I have to start learning Chinese before I can even think about Korea. So I did. I did take Chinese for 1 year at Columbia, and it was a very exciting learning period for me. But my mother was a widow, and I had a younger sister, so I had to go back to Los Angeles to help the family. And though I continued to study at USC, it was very difficult to study and to work and to hold on to that dream. So I never got there. But I did continue in social work. And I worked in social work. I worked at the airport. I was a traveler's aid counselor. I worked for special education. I worked at UCLA in a couple of programs there. And eventually, my husband and I left for Northern California because he had received a grant to work at the Ames Laboratory in Palo Alto. So that's how we got up here. And then eventually he went into business, so that's what I did. I was a business assistant. What else did I do? My uncle was, at that time, David Hyun. He is an architect, my mother's youngest brother. And he was the architect for Japanese Village Plaza, which is very well known in Los Angeles on First Street. And he asked me to come down and work with him. So I did. I was the marketing director of his Japanese Village Plaza for a couple of years. And by that time, I'd been divorced from my husband, but I still had a home up in Santa Rosa. And though my mother was still alive and living in a senior home, but she was well taken care of in Los Angeles, and I felt I had to go home. I had to go home to my own home. And one of the reasons I went home is because it was my 60th birthday. And in Korea, you call that Hanguk, right? I decided I would celebrate my Hanguk. And I decided that I would run a marathon. So I trained for the marathon in Santa Rosa, which was very country at that time. And another reason why I did it is because the marathon that I went to was in Moscow. It was in 1989. And my grandfather went to Moscow in 1921 or 22 at the Second Communist Convention in Moscow. And he took the train from Vladivostok all the way over to Moscow. And he would tell me about that trip and how much he saw of the country. So it was kind of like returning to where my grandfather had been. I mean, I remember that, and my Uncle Peter came up to wish me well because he had never been to Russia, but here I was, the next generation, going back to a country that his father had visited. So that was an exciting time for me, a very exciting time. And I joined the race, but I didn't run it. I walked it, and I did the whole thing. 26.2 miles. I finished it, and I have a medal to show it. There were 30 countries that were represented, and that was the last year for Russia's Soviet Union, because it disbanded in 1990, I think. So I was there still during the Soviet times. And I did go to see a Korean family there. And you know, it was very strange. They had a little market, and I had brought some chopsticks and some other things to give to them, because I knew there were Koreans in Russia. And you know, when I gave it to them, they hardly knew what they were. I was so surprised. I said, but these are chopsticks, and they, you know, but they were Russians. They no longer thought of themselves as Koreans, which was amazing. I thought it was amazing. Didn't you think that was amazing? I mean, I, as an American, consider myself a Korean too, right? Yeah. So that was one of the highlights of my life, going to Russia and finishing that race. Do you have any other questions?
Well, I was just thinking of your. You said that you did after you married Joe, you went on long periods of mission work with the Episcopalian Church.
You know, it's really strange how I met my next husband. I was living in Santa Rosa, and I was training every day, walking to enter the marathon. I went up in April, and the marathon took place in August. I met Joe on August the 6th. You know what that day is? That's the day of the Hiroshima bombing. But according to the Christian calendar, it's the day of the Transfiguration. Well, that day transfigured me. Transfigured me, because that's the day I met Joe. And we both lived out in the country. It wasn't even in the city. And I was walking every day 5 miles to get ready for this race, and he was walking. So we were the only two people walking for months and months and months. We never said hello. We just walk, you know, he'd walk ahead, or I'd walk ahead. He's coming this way and I'm going that way. And I'm wondering, who is this man? Anyway, on the 5th day of August, I decided that I would walk 20 miles to get ready for that 26-mile walk. So I did. I walked 9 miles out, and I walked 9 miles back, and that meant I had to walk 2 more miles. So I walked past where I lived, and as I was walking back, this man said hello. He said, hello. I was so surprised. And so we talked, and we're walking, and you know, you meet a stranger and you wonder, well, what have you got to say to a stranger? So he said to me that this was at 11:30, and we usually walked at 5 o'clock in the morning. So he said, why are you out here so late? I said, but I've been on the road since 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock. I said, yeah, I'm going tomorrow to Moscow. You're going to Moscow? Yeah. And so he was interested. And so I asked him, well, why are you out at 11:30? And he said, well, the bishop asked him to do the service at the church, to do the Eucharist. And I said, yeah, all right. And now, I'm a Methodist. I didn't know anything about what a Eucharist was, but obviously it was the communion for the Transfiguration. I learned later. And anyway, we talked, and then finally I said to him, I said, well, I know of only one Episcopalian, and he was my brother's roommate at college. And he said, really? I said, I think he's a priest in Hawaii. Really? He said, I was a priest in Hawaii. Really? So I said, okay. He said, well, what's his name? So I said, his name is George Lee. He said, George Lee? That's the minister that married me and my wife. Is that a miracle? I mean, let me see, we're both in our 60s, and and we're connecting back when we're 18 years old. So that was the beginning of my life with Joe Pummill, who's a retired Episcopal minister. And in the years of his retirement, he volunteered as a priest to go to England. And that meant that we would have to live there for 6 months at a time. And we did that for a few years, and we became very well known in the same village. We did that. So we still have friends in Bakewell, Derbyshire County. It was a wonderful experience, getting to know the English people, the English customs, and the English countryside. So that's that. Well, I don't know whether it was a missionary work. It certainly was a revealing work to find out how the church developed in England.
That must have been really a wonderful experience for you.
It was. It certainly was.
Right. Well, I don't really know whether you keep close contact with the Korean American community now, but how do you see the changes in the community over the years, or do you?
I certainly have.
Yeah.
I can't really consider myself a Korean because I don't speak the language. The best I can do is eat Korean food. I can understand, very simple language, like you would talk to a child. I can follow that, but I wouldn't be able to follow much of anything else. When we came to Los Angeles, unfortunately, my family did not settle where the Koreans lived, and they lived in the southern part, and my father got a business in the northern part. So I attended school with other people other than Koreans, and the only time I met Koreans was at church or when there were parties or weddings. But and then when I went to UCLA, I was the only girl, Korean woman, with 2 Korean men who went to UCLA. And there were 2 Korean women who came from Honolulu. So there were only 5 of us. And eventually there were 2 more Korean women from Los Angeles. So that's less than 2 handful of Koreans. And it's pretty hard to keep up your community without attending it. So I would say that most of my life I have mainstreamed out into other groups. But recently, Tosan Anchang-o's youngest son is Ralph An, and he's still alive. And he and I were in the same class in college. He went to USC and I went to UCLA. So we would meet at different times at churches and at functions. And he's still alive, and he's very much involved with the Korean American Patriots organization, which is down in Los Angeles, which meets every year and has a great big luncheon in Koreatown. And I have gone to a couple of those luncheons. And most recently, wasn't it an anniversary this last summer? Was it a Korean anniversary? 100th year. So I did go down in April for the 100th year anniversary, where they had a convention of a couple of days at USC, and they had brought the archives up to date. So I went down for a day. I didn't stay the whole 2 days. And then in August, this is still August, isn't it? A couple of weeks ago, there was another gathering of the Korean American Patriots descendants. They had a luncheon, and thereafter they attended a musical theater, and it was based on the life of Dosan on Chang-o, which I heard was wonderful, with many Korean actors and actresses and dancers, and I hope it comes up here. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I heard.
Yeah.
I'd like to see it. So I don't know, what else can I say?
Well, I think that
So as far as keeping in touch with Korean community, it's hard for me because I don't speak the language. You know, when I was going to Korean church as a child, we'd have to go for at least 2 or 3 hours to church, because first it was in Korean, then it was in English, then back to Korean. I mean, you know, it was very hard to have the faith in that circumstance.
in 1950, when Korean War broke out, how was your family? What was their concern, and how did they think of this?
Well, let's see. I was just in my last year of the university, and as I said, I had never been that close to the Korean community, and certainly at the university, I never saw Koreans, and my associations were primarily with Japanese Americans who had returned from the camps, you know, and I personally, I never felt what my parents felt, of course, about how the Japanese treated Koreans, but my father was adamant about anti-Japanese feelings. And I certainly never told him I had Japanese American friends. But I know that I told you previously, people didn't know what Koreans were. There were so few of us. And I was asked, when I told them I was Korean, they would ask me, I mean, I'm an American citizen, they would ask me, are you North Korean or South Korean? You know, and it was really very disturbing. And I never answered that question. I never said that I was South Korean, or I just said, I'm a Korean. I don't know anything about North Korean and South Korean, and besides that, I'm an American. You know, how could people know? There were no Korean restaurants, there were no Korean communities, there were no Korean food. You know, now Korean restaurants are so popular, right? They go to Korean grocery stores and you see Korean foods in Safeway, but that wasn't the case then. They didn't know anything about us. I could have said I was a monkey and they'd, excuse me, that was uncalled for, but it really made me angry. And I didn't really know about the Korean War. I really didn't know. And as far as, I think that growing up, the war that we were concerned with was the Second World War. You know, that was our generation. And as Americans, we fought the Japanese and we fought the Germans, but we didn't know about fighting North Korea or what was going on there. Besides that, you know, my grandfather was prohibited from going back to Korea. You know, the Korean government after World War II was very factional. And you know, Syngman Rhee was a very authoritarian president. And he was my grandfather's cohort of early years, and he forbade my grandfather from coming. And because my grandfather's philosophy and political feelings were more to the left and not to the right. And I guess Syngman Rhee felt that he was not wanted there. So he never got back to Korea until in 1978, maybe 75, the Korean government asked for my grandmother and grandfather's ashes to be brought back to the Korean National Cemetery. And there, my grandfather and my grandmother's ashes are buried. And I have been to Korea twice, once with my mother in 1980, and the last time I went was, I think 2.5 years ago. I went, and I did go up to his gravesite, and he's all the way up at the top. I'm very happy about that. I'm very happy that he's there with his wife, and he's being honored finally. He's back to his homeland.
So now Korea is a very different country. It's come a long way. And what is your feeling about the Korea's place in the globe, so to speak, in the world?
Well, I think Korea as a nation is unbelievable, and I had been to Korea a couple of years ago, and I just can't believe the progress and the well, in many ways, I think they're ahead of the United States in providing the services to the people. I mean, the public transportation, for one. I mean, you can't get around in Los Angeles or San Francisco without a car. But I think that Korea has taken its place in the world, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure all the reasons why, but certainly the division in the country has made it what it is today. But I would like to see Korea unified someday, and it probably won't be unified in my day, but I would think that Korea at some point would become one nation for all of its people. And as a whole nation, it can provide so much to the rest of the world. First it went through the occupation with the Japanese, and then it was divided into two countries, and that was very shameful, I think. I don't know how Koreans, I don't know that much about Koreans in the US, but I hope that there are Koreans who go back to Korea and work towards this unification of the country, because it's a wonderful country with wonderful people. I think I have talked to many people who feel that the Koreans of the Asians are one of the most diligent of peoples, as well as they're also very smart people. I don't know, and I see, and I hear, and I see young people who are going into many diversified kinds of vocations and professions, and that's good. That sure is a far cry from when I grew up, because I'll tell you, there were very few positions open to our parents. So times have changed, and I'm glad to see it. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, thank you so much.
I mean, really, when you think about it,
Yeah.
I'll tell you, the Koreans in the 30s,
Yeah.
they were houseboys. They were cooks. They didn't even have stores, right? They didn't have shops. It was very slow. Or they worked on the plantations. They worked on farms. So when the new Koreans came in after World War II, they asked, well, what did you do for 50 years? You know, well, they just lived as best that they could. That's true of all other immigrants, you know? When you think of immigration today, people coming in with less language, and what are they capable of doing but labor? Another thing, you're not on, this isn't on, right? Don't forget, civil rights, Martin Luther King opened up rights for all people. Before that, it was all white people, and then there were other people. But now, it's more equal. It's not there yet, but of course, that has helped, really. So.
Thank you so much.